At 7:49 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Canadian infantry stepped off landing craft onto Juno Beach already behind schedule, already under fire, and already operating on assumptions that no longer applied. The sea was rougher than forecast. The tanks meant to land ahead of the infantry were late or missing. German positions that were supposed to be suppressed were very much alive. Within minutes, units were taking losses before they could orient themselves, let alone advance. What followed was not a clean assault or a textbook landing. It was a series of decisions made faster than the plan allowed, on a beach that refused to behave as predicted. Juno Beach did not exist in the original vision of Operation Overlord. Early invasion plans envisioned fewer assault sectors, with British forces landing to the east and American forces to the west. As planning matured, the gap between the British beaches widened, and the need for an additional landing zone became unavoidable. That zone became Juno. The decision to place a Canadian assault force there was both operational and political. By 1944, Canada had committed a large army overseas and had spent years preparing for a decisive role in the invasion of Western Europe. Canadian leaders made it clear that symbolic participation would not suffice. If Canadian divisions were committed, they would land on D-Day, not follow after the beachhead was secure. From an operational standpoint, the sector between Gold and Sword beaches offered both opportunity and risk. The coastline included several small seaside towns, Courcelette-sur-Mer, Bernay-sur-Mer, and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, that provided ready-made exits inland if captured quickly. Those same towns also provided hardened firing positions, reinforced concrete, and clear fields of fire across the beaches. Juno's objectives were ambitious. Canadian forces were expected not only to secure the shoreline, but to push inland rapidly, capture key road junctions, and link up with British units advancing towards Caen. On paper, this made Juno a supporting beach. In practice, it required an assault with enough momentum to keep pace with armor-heavy British advances on both flanks. Planners believed the risk was manageable. Intelligence assessments classified the defending German forces as static, under strength, and poorly equipped compared to the formations expected opposite Omaha Beach. Naval bombardment and aerial bombing were expected to neutralize strong points long enough for assault waves to establish control. Specialized armor would follow closely behind the infantry to break resistance at the waterline. None of those assumptions accounted for timing slipping just enough to expose the infantry first, or for fortified towns remaining intact, or for how quickly the margin for error would disappear once the first ramp dropped. Juno was assigned as a calculated risk, one planners believed could be absorbed by preparation, coordination, and speed. What they did not plan for was how unforgiving that calculation would become when even one variable failed. The assault force assigned to Juno Beach was built around the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade. On paper, it was a balanced force. Infantry trained for amphibious assault, armor intended to land close behind them, engineers tasked with clearing obstacles, and artillery planned to come ashore quickly. In reality, much of that balance depended on timing working exactly as intended. The first wave consisted of 3 infantry regiments, each prepared with a specific stretch of beach and a specific town inland. These were not ad hoc formations. Units trained together for months in Britain, rehearsing landings, studying beach models, and practicing coordination with armor and naval fire. What they did not have was combat experience as a division. Most of the men stepping off the landing craft on June 6 had never been under fire before. Training emphasized speed. Infantry were expected to clear the beach quickly, neutralize strong points, and move inland before German reserves could react. Canadian doctrine favored momentum over consolidation, based on the belief that hesitation on the shoreline invited counterfire and collapse. That doctrine assumed tanks would be present early, suppressing machine gun nests and punching through concrete positions that infantry alone could not reduce quickly. The armored support for the assault relied heavily on amphibious Sherman tanks, launched offshore and expected to swim in ahead of the infantry. Their role was simple: arrive first, draw fire, and break resistance at the exits. Engineers would then clear obstacles and mines, opening lanes for follow-on waves. Infantry would exploit the gaps. The infantry themselves were well equipped, but heavily burdened. Assault loads included rifles, ammunition, explosives, radios, and entrenching tools, all carried through surf that was deeper and rougher than planned. Men landed already fatigued, struggling to orient themselves while under fire, often without clear visual reference points due to smoke, debris, and overlapping fields of fire from the shore. Leadership at the platoon and company level was critical. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were expected to make immediate decisions without waiting for orders. If a landing craft drifted off course, if a tank failed to arrive, or if a beach exit was blocked, units were trained to adapt and push forward anyway. That flexibility was intentional. It was also untested. What the Canadian Assault Force brought to Juneau was preparation rather than experience, structure rather than improvisation born of combat. The plan depended on coordination between elements that have never been forced to operate independently under live fire. The men landing at Juneau were not expected to win the day through heroics or brute force. They were expected to execute a system: infantry, armor, engineers, and naval fire working in sequence. The problem was that the system required conditions that no longer existed by the time the first wave reached the beach. And when that system fractured, it would be those same junior leaders in first wave infantry who had to decide what happened next, without waiting for the rest of the plan to catch up. The German defenses opposite Juneau Beach were part of the broader Atlantic Wall, but they did not resemble the continuous fortress often implied by post-war imagery. Instead, the coastline was defended by a network of strongpoints, each designed to cover specific approaches, exits, and fields of fire. The system relied on overlap rather than density, with gaps intentionally left between positions to funnel attackers into predictable killing zones. Responsibility for the sector fell primarily to the 716th Infantry Division, a unit comprised largely of older soldiers, limited mobility elements, and personnel drawn from occupied territories. On paper, it was not a first-rate formation. In practice, its fixed positions compensated for its lack of maneuver capability. The division's role was not to counterattack aggressively, but to hold long enough for mobile reserves farther inland to respond. The most dangerous features of Juneau were not the beach obstacles themselves, but the towns built directly onto the shoreline. Courcelette-sur-Mer, Bernay-sur-Mer, and Sedan-sur-Mer each contained reinforced concrete positions integrated into seawalls, private homes, and commercial buildings. Machine guns and anti-tank weapons were sighted to fire laterally across the beaches rather than directly out to sea, maximizing exposure time for troops moving inland. Many of these positions survived the preliminary bombardment. Naval gunfire and aerial attacks damaged some installations, but others remained intact or only partially suppressed. Smoke and dust further complicated targeting, and once the bombardment lifted, German crews reoccupied weapons quickly. The defensive plan assumed that even brief survival would be enough to disrupt landing schedules and expose infantry before armor could arrive. Beach obstacles were positioned with tidal timing in mind. Mines, steel ramps, and wooden stakes were intended to be submerged at high tide and exposed at low tide, forcing landing craft into narrow channels. On Juneau, delays pushed the assault closer to high tide, reducing the number of visible obstacles, but compressing the landing zone. This left infantry with less room to maneuver once ashore and limited the effectiveness of evasive movement. German fields of fire were carefully arranged to exploit this compression. Strongpoints covered likely landing lanes, beach exits, and road approaches inland. Anti-tank guns were positioned to engage vehicles attempting to leave the beach, while machine guns targeted infantry moving laterally or clustering near obstacles. Mortar fire, though limited in volume, added to the disorientation rather than delivering mass casualties. What the German defenders lacked in flexibility, they made up for in preparation. Range cards were preset, fields of fire were rehearsed, defensive responsibility was clearly defined, even if coordination between strongpoints was minimal. Each position was designed to fight independently, assuming isolation rather than relief. The Canadian assault plan relied on suppressing these positions long enough to pass through them. The German defense relied on surviving just long enough to break the rhythm of that passage. By the time the first landing craft touched down, that contest was already underway, before any Canadian unit had fully stepped onto the sand. The first landing craft touched down on Juneau Beach later than planned. Sea conditions slowed the approach, and the delay meant German defenders had additional time to recover from the naval bombardment. As ramps dropped, infantry disembarked into water deeper than expected. Some men immediately submerged under the weight of their equipment. Several assault sections landed off their intended marks. Tidal drift pushed craft laterally, placing units in front of unfamiliar strongpoints or farther from planned exits. Commanders had only seconds to assess whether to regroup or move forward where they were. In most cases, they chose to move. Machine gun fire opened almost immediately. German positions fired across the beach rather than directly toward the sea, catching men as they tried to move inland or regroup behind obstacles. Casualties occurred within moments of landing, often before platoons had fully formed. Radios were lost or damaged in the surf, forcing leaders to rely on hand signals and shouted commands that were frequently drowned out by weapons fires and explosions. The amphibious tanks meant to precede the infantry were not present in strength. Some had been launched too far offshore and struggled in the heavy seas. Others arrived late, landing among infantry already under fire rather than ahead of them. Without armored suppression, Canadian troops were forced to advance using smoke, terrain folds, and whatever cover the beach offered. Engineers tasked with clearing obstacles moved forward under direct fire. Demolition charges were placed on mines and steel barriers, while infantry provided what limited covering fire they could. Several clearance teams took losses before lanes were opened, slowing the arrival of follow-on waves and vehicles. Beach exits proved difficult to identify. Smoke from bombardment, burning equipment, and collapsing structures obscured landmarks. In some sectors, exits were covered by intact strongpoints, firing down narrow approaches. Infantry attempted to flank these positions using gaps between obstacles or by moving directly through built-up areas at the edge of towns. Small unit leadership became decisive almost immediately. With senior officers often delayed or cut off, corporals and sergeants took control of fragmented groups and pushed them forward. Assault sections combined with nearby units, regardless of regimental alignment, forming ad hoc groups focused solely on moving inland. German fire remained uneven but persistent. Some strongpoints were knocked out quickly by direct hits or concentrated infantry action. Others continued firing until overwhelmed from the rear or bypassed entirely. The defense lacked centralized coordination, but individual positions fought according to prearranged plans. Within the first 20 minutes, the beach was neither secured nor lost. Infantry had begun to penetrate the seawall in several locations, while other sectors remained pinned. Casualties were accumulating unevenly, concentrated where landings had drifted into heavier fire zones. Vehicles were beginning to pile up behind partially cleared lanes, while additional landing craft continued to arrive under fire. What mattered most in this opening phase was that the movement had begun. Units that advanced, even without support, reduced their exposure time and forced German defenders to react locally rather than fire freely across the beach. Where movement stalled, losses mounted. By the time the initial assault waves had either moved inland or taken cover near the waterline, the battle had already fragmented into dozens of small fights, none of them following the original landing diagram, all of them unfolding simultaneously. The beachhead was being shaped not by the plan, but by which groups managed to get off the sand first. The transition from exposed beach to controlled ground did not happen evenly. In some sectors, Canadian infantry reached the seawall within minutes. In others, men were still pinned behind obstacles as later waves arrived. What broke the stalemate was not a single action, but a series of local solutions applied independently along the frontage. In the western sector, near Courcelette-sur-Mer, infantry began moving directly into the town rather than attempting to clear every firing position facing the beach. Small groups entered buildings that had been used as strongpoints, attacking from the rear or upper floors. Machine guns that had dominated the shoreline were silenced, not by frontal assault, but by being cut off from their fields of fire. Further east at Bernay-sur-Mer, progress depended on engineers. Beach exits were narrow, mined, and covered by direct fire. Clearance teams worked in short bursts, moving forward just long enough to place charges before pulling back. Each successful detonation opened only a partial route, but it was enough to start feeding infantry and vehicles through in small numbers rather than all at once. Armored support began to appear in ones and twos rather than as a wave. Shermans that made it ashore were immediately committed to suppressing remaining strongpoints or blasting openings through masonry walls. Their arrival changed the geometry of the fight. German defenders who had been oriented toward the beach suddenly faced fire from angles they had not prepared for, forcing rapid withdrawal or surrender. The fight inside the coastal towns was brief but sharp. Streets were narrow, sightlines short, and civilian structures tightly packed. Canadian units avoided prolonged clearance whenever possible, bypassing isolated resistance and pushing toward the inland roads that anchored German defensive plans. This left pockets of resistance behind the advancing infantry, but those pockets no longer controlled the movement of the assault. Command and control remained fragmented. Battalion headquarters were still coming ashore, and radio communication was unreliable. This accelerated movement in some areas and caused confusion in others, but it prevented the entire assault from stalling in response to isolated resistance. German defenders attempted to adjust, shifting fire inward towards exits and road junctions as the beach itself became less relevant. Without mobile reserves on hand, these adjustments were limited. Individual strongpoints fought until they were flanked or out of ammunition. Others disengaged and moved inland, hoping to rejoin secondary defensive lines that were already under pressure. By mid-morning, the character of the fight had changed. The most exposed phase of the landing was over. Infantry were no longer clustered on open sand, and vehicles were beginning to flow inland in greater numbers. The beach itself became a logistical problem rather than a tactical one. crowded with wounded, damaged equipment, and the steady arrival of follow-on forces. The cost of the delay was uneven. Units that broke through early suffered fewer casualties than those held under fire while exits were cleared. The landing schedule was no longer synchronized, and the original sequencing of forces had dissolved. What remained intact was momentum. Canadian forces did not pause to consolidate the shoreline. Once routes inland were usable, even if imperfect, units continued forward. This decision carried risk. Flanks were not fully secured, and gaps opened between advancing elements, but it also denied German defenders the time needed to reorganize and establish a coherent second line. Breaking off the sand did not mean the battle had stabilized. It meant the conditions of survival had changed. The most dangerous phase of the landing was behind them, replaced by a moving fight inland where speed, rather than exposure, would decide whether the early gains could be held. The assault at Juno had cleared its first and most unforgiving obstacle. What followed would test whether that momentum could be sustained without outrunning the support that made it possible. Once Canadian units cleared the coastal towns and established usable exits, the pace of the operation increased sharply. Movement inland began in overlapping columns rather than organized waves, shaped by whichever routes had been opened first rather than by the original landing timetable. Infantry, armor, and engineers advanced together when possible, and independently when they had to. Sherman tanks that survived the landing were now able to operate as intended. Instead of engaging fixed positions from the beach, they moved along roads and field edges, providing direct fire against retreating German elements and suppressing ad hoc resistance near road junctions. Their presence reduced the need for deliberate infantry assaults and allowed forward movement to continue even when opposition remained scattered but active. The inland terrain favored rapid advance in some areas and slowed it in others. Hedgerows, drainage ditches, and narrow roads constrained movement and forced units into predictable axes of advance. Where German positions had not been fully neutralized, this created brief but violent engagements as Canadian columns encountered resistance from positions that had been bypassed during the initial push off the beach. Despite these frictions, Canadian units advanced farther inland on D-Day than any other Allied force. Elements reached or approached portions of the Caen-Bayeux Road, a depth well beyond their primary objectives for the day. This advance was not uniform. Some units pushed aggressively forward, while others lagged behind, dealing with resistance, traffic congestion, or delayed equipment. The speed of the advance created new problems. Communication between units became increasingly unreliable as formations spread out and radio networks remained incomplete. Gaps opened between Canadian elements and between Canadian and British forces on the flanks. In several areas, infantry advanced without immediate armored support, while tanks moved forward with limited infantry protection. German resistance inland was uneven but increasingly reactive. Lacking coordinated reserves, defenders attempted to delay the advance through small unit actions rather than organized counterattacks. Anti-tank guns and infantry positions appeared near key intersections and villages, engaging advancing columns briefly before withdrawing or being overrun. Canadian commanders at the tactical level faced a choice: pause to secure their gains or continue advancing while the opportunity existed. In most cases, they chose to move forward. This decision reflected both training and circumstance. The landing had already disrupted the planned sequence of the operation, and stopping to reorganize risked allowing German forces time to regroup. By early afternoon, the Canadian advance had reached the limits of what could be supported from the beaches. Supply lines were stretched, artillery support was delayed, and coordination with neighboring units remained incomplete. The initial shock of the landing had carried the assault farther than expected, but that same momentum now threatened to outrun the infrastructure needed to sustain it. The danger was no longer concentrated fire on open sand, it was isolation. Units operating at the edge of the advance faced the possibility of counterattack without immediate reinforcement. German armored formations were known to be positioned farther inland, and the longer Canadian forces remained extended, the greater the risk that those formations could intervene. Momentum had carried the assault beyond its planned depth. Whether that momentum could be held or would have to be traded for consolidation would define the next phase of the battle. By mid-afternoon on June 6, the Canadian advance inland from Juno Beach had reached a critical point. Forward elements were operating beyond their planned objectives, while supporting units were still moving through congested beach exits and partially cleared towns. The success of the morning had created a fragile situation in which speed and vulnerability increased at the same rate. The most immediate risk came from the absence of firm flanks. To the west, Canadian units advancing beyond Courcelette-sur-Mer were not yet fully linked with British forces from Gold Beach. To the east, the connection with units landing at Sword Beach was incomplete. These gaps left Canadian formations exposed to the possibility of lateral movement by German forces, even if no large-scale counterattack materialized. German command elements were beginning to reassert control inland. While the coastal strongpoints had been neutralized or bypassed, mobile German units were moving cautiously toward contact. Reports of armored formations filtering toward the area raised concerns that Canadian infantry, advancing without full artillery or anti-tank coverage, could be caught in open ground. Communications compounded the risk. Radio links remained unreliable, and the ad hoc nature of the advance meant that some units were operating with only a partial understanding of the broader situation. Forward commanders often had clearer awareness of the ground immediately ahead of them than the forces on their flanks or rear. In response, Canadian units began to slow their pace selectively. Rather than pushing deeper in all sectors, commanders prioritized securing key road junctions and defensible terrain. Infantry consolidated positions around villages and crossroads that controlled movement inland, while engineers worked to improve supply routes back to the beaches. German resistance during this phase was cautious rather than aggressive. Lacking clear superiority and facing uncertainty about Allied strength, German units engaged in delaying actions instead of decisive counterattacks. These engagements were short and localized, designed to test Canadian positions rather than dislodge them. The expected armored counterstroke never fully developed on June 6. Whether due to confusion, command delays, or the cumulative disruption caused by the landings across Normandy, German mobile reserves did not arrive in time to exploit the Canadian overextension. This absence proved decisive. The window during which Canadian units were most vulnerable passed without being fully exploited. By evening, the Canadian advance had stabilized. Units that had pushed furthest inland adjusted their positions to reduce exposure, while follow-on forces filled in gaps and strengthened the line. Artillery and additional armor began to come ashore in greater numbers, reducing the risk of sudden isolation. The near miss at Juno was not the result of a single dramatic confrontation, but of timing. Canadian forces had advanced faster than their support, and German forces had failed to react quickly enough to capitalize on that imbalance. The result was a tenuous but survivable position that held through the night. Juno Beach had delivered more than its planners expected, and more than its defenders could fully counter. The danger had not passed, but the moment when the landing could have unraveled was over. The cost of the landing at Juno Beach can be measured cleanly, even if its meaning cannot. By the end of June 6, Canadian forces had suffered approximately 1,000 casualties, including roughly 340 killed. These losses were not evenly distributed. Units that landed directly in front of intact strongpoints absorbed the majority of casualties within the first hour. Others, landing only hundreds of yards away, moved inland with comparatively lighter losses. Casualty rates during the opening phase placed Juno closer to Omaha than to the other British assault beaches. When measured as a percentage of troops landed in the first waves, Canadian losses were among the highest of D-Day. This was not due to prolonged exposure, but to the concentration of fire during a compressed landing window caused by delays and tidal conditions. Officer casualties were particularly high. Platoon and company commanders were exposed early, moving forward to orient their men, identify exits, and direct movements under fire. Losses among junior officers forced rapid succession of command, often within minutes of landing. Non-commissioned officers filled the gap, maintaining unit cohesion at the smallest levels, while higher command structures were still forming ashore. Material losses followed a similar pattern. Several landing craft were damaged or destroyed during approach or unloading. Vehicles were lost to mines, artillery fire, or congestion at exits before they could be employed effectively. Amphibious tanks suffered attrition both at sea and upon landing, reducing armored strength during the most critical phase of the assault. Despite these losses, Canadian forces achieved a depth of advance unmatched on D-Day. This outcome complicates simple comparisons. Higher casualty percentages did not translate into stalled movement or operational failure. Instead, losses were absorbed while forward momentum continued, shifting risk from the shoreline to the interior. German losses are harder to quantify with precision. Records indicate significant casualties among static defense units and the loss of numerous strongpoints, either destroyed, abandoned, or isolated. Prisoners were taken throughout the day, particularly once Canadian forces moved inland and cut off coastal positions from reinforcement or withdrawal. What the numbers show most clearly is imbalance. Losses were front-loaded, concentrated in the first phase of the landing, and borne primarily by assault infantry and junior leaders. Once Canadian forces cleared the immediate beach defenses, casualty rates declined even as the advance continued. The figures do not convey confusion, fear, or exhaustion. They do not show the effect of delay measured in minutes or the cost of exposure measured in seconds. They show only that the landing succeeded at a higher price than anticipated, paid early, and carried forward rather than corrected through pause or consolidation. By the end of the day, the numbers no longer described a landing in progress. They described a foothold established, unevenly secured, and held long enough to become permanent. Juno Beach did not unfold according to the plan, and it did not need to. The landing succeeded not because its assumptions held, but because Canadian units adapted faster than the conditions changed. Delays, intact defenses, and fragmented landings did not stop the assault from moving inland. They reshaped how it moved. What emerged from Juno was not a textbook example of amphibious warfare, but a demonstration of what happens when rigid planning gives way to local decision-making. Junior leaders acted without waiting for synchronization that no longer existed. Engineers cleared partial solutions rather than complete ones. Armor was committed as soon as it arrived, regardless of sequence. The result was a landing that absorbed heavy losses early and then denied the defenders time to recover. Canadian forces reached farther inland than expected, not because resistance was light, but because it was fragmented. German defenses survived long enough to disrupt the landing, but not long enough to control what followed. Juno's place in memory has often been reduced to its position between better-known beaches. That framing misses what mattered. Juno combined some of the heaviest initial resistance in the British sector with one of the deepest advances of the day. Those two facts coexist, even if they are uncomfortable to reconcile. By nightfall on June 6, Juno was no longer a beach. It was a supply line, a casualty collection point, and a launching ground for continued operations inland. The landing phase was over, replaced by a campaign that would grind forward for weeks. What Juno proved was not that planning was unnecessary or that experience could be improvised. It proved that plans fail in predictable ways, and that the difference between collapse and continuation is how quickly units adjust when they do. On Juno Beach, that adjustment happened fast enough to matter. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
I'm Bob McKenzie, this is my brother Doug.
How's it going, eh?
And we're having a Molson with Hall of Famer Guy Lafleur, eh?
Yeah, Lafleur, that's like a real hockey name. What's that mean, eh? Like the wolf?
Or the lion, eh?
No, Lafleur means the flower.
Well, like a tough flower, eh? Like a dogwood or a snapdragon, eh? Roses have thorns, eh? They're tough. You're tough.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?